Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you so very much for being with us today. We're very glad and very honored to have Dr. Amina Wadud with us today to speak about Islamic feminism and what is in the name. Dr. Amina Wadud is a world-renowned scholar and activist with a focus on Islam, justice, gender, and sexuality. After receiving or achieving full professor, she retired from the US academia, except as visiting researcher to the Starr King School for the Ministry in California in the United States. And after 15 years in retirement, she has recently returned as visiting professor at the National Islamic University in Indonesia. She migrated to Indonesia in 2018 to avoid the chaos of US politics and ethics firsthand. She is the author of Quran and Women, rereading the sacred text from a woman's perspective in 1999, a classic that helped towards development of epistemology and methodology in Islamic feminism, which is the most dynamic outcome of Islamic reform today, one would say. It's 3 decades old and is translated over 10 times, most recently into French. Her second manuscript, Inside the Gender Jihad, Women's Reform in Islam, then moved the discussion further and aligned with the mandate for ethics and activism to be in collaboration. After completing a 3-year research grant, investigating 500 years of Islamic classical discourse on sexual diversity and human dignity, funded by the Arcus Foundation, she is organizing an international center for queer Islamic theology, which is the first in the world. She's a mother of 5 and a nana to 6. She is best known as the Lady Imam. So today, Dr. Amina is with us to speak and provide an overview of the historical development of a hybrid Islamic or Islam combined with an intersectional feminism, rather being called Islamic feminism. And of course, Islamic feminism is a conflation of several factors impacting discourse, research, and activism by and about Muslim women. Islamic feminism is distinct from Muslim feminism as a critical approach to text in deference to context. It creates alternative readings to those canonized throughout Muslim history in order to remove Islam from the centuries-long privileging of patriarchy. We expect Dr. Amina's presentation to run for about 45 minutes, and then we'll be having 45 minutes more for question and answers. So feel free to type those questions in the chat, or you can always raise your virtual hand as well to ask those questions to Dr. Amina directly. And also, please do mute yourself and feel free to have your camera on as well. So that being said, we're very privileged in BRISMES and as a BRISMES Council member to welcome Dr. Amina Wadud here today to speak to us about what is in the name of Islamic feminism. The floor is yours, Dr. Amina. Thank you so very much.
A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. I begin, as I always begin, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and in all other matters. Thank you very much for having me. I am in Indonesia and the sun will be setting, so I hope my light will be sufficient. Also, this beautiful painting is on the wall. I'm not at home, I'm in a hotel. I don't even want to explain why I'm here. But in any case, I'm glad that everything has linked up. I'm going to read from a recent publication that I have on perspectives on Islamic feminist exegesis in the Quran to respond to the question, what's in a name? Islamic feminist exegesis of the Quran was a precursor to the rise of Islamic feminism as methodology and movement. In 1992, when I published my PhD dissertation under the name Quran and Woman, there was no such thing as Islamic feminism. Instead, one had to choose between feminisms that were overwhelmingly hostile to religion, especially Islam, and the dominant interpretation of Islam that was overwhelmingly patriarchal. These are now referred to as secular feminism and as Islamism or political Islam. The most common mantra was, you cannot have feminism and Islam. While some still think this is the case, overall, a vibrant and intersectional movement began to take place as we entered the new millennium, challenging the dominant rubrics of both feminism and Islam. The first publication of Quran and Woman in Malaysia did not lead to a revolution. While it was being edited for publication, however, I entered a new revolutionary life trajectory that would impact my interpretive work. As one of 8 founding members to a grassroots women's organization called Sisters in Islam, I would enter Muslim feminist activism for social justice from within an Islamic faith perspective, which would change my textual hermeneutics. As a PhD student, it was easy to locate my individual self as a Muslim woman within my exegesis. I had no concept of relating it to Muslim women as a collective in their lived realities within the context of culture, policy, and law. There is no Muslim personal status law in the United States. The ad hoc legal postulates in certain Muslim communities are overwhelmingly patriarchal, but these are not the law of the land, and so they lack state enforcement. Working with CIS for the 3 years that I was in Malaysia, I saw the important nexus between theory and praxis. This would lead me to promote the idea of context over text in my analysis. The context of lived realities for Muslim women, especially when used in codification of public policy, would come to eclipse the text wherever it was used to enforce patriarchal hegemony. Here I will discuss the importance of lived realities to the hermeneutics of the Quran. This led me to new knowledge production and an expansion of authority beyond the dominant male control of nearly 14 centuries. In turn, this would lead me to Islamic feminism. As the Islamic feminist movement began to unfold in the 1990s, it challenged the existing frameworks of feminisms, even amongst Muslims. It also helped me to transform my approach to hermeneutics. While Islamic feminism could be said to be part of global feminisms and of Islamic reform in the new millennium, it has taken a more comprehensive and truly global step, more so than any other aspect of Islamic reform, in my opinion. Indeed, any aspect of reform that does not engage the gender dynamic is outdated and incomplete. The journey towards Islamic feminist knowledge production, as distinct from previously confirmed ideas of feminism, depended upon a coherent methodology of using gender as a category of interrogation for all Islamic primary sources and for their application in the law and culture. It dismantles more than 1,000 years of patriarchal control over textual exegesis and Muslim lives. While Islamic feminism centers on the lived realities of Muslim women, it's not just about women. It is about moving the understanding of gender from hegemony and control to equality and reciprocity. My first book, Quran and Woman, is deeply intuitive and critically analytical and explicitly gender inclusive. It enhanced the field of Quranic exegesis by confirming not only that Muslim women speak, but also by providing evidence that when we speak, we do so from our own realities. Furthermore, it gave evidence that men had been speaking from their own lived realities for centuries and calling it universal. As Muslim women speak, we say some things differently from what men have said for over a millennium. Although Islamic feminist exegesis is more than just women, to include women's lived realities in Quranic analysis challenges the dominant and prolific model of centering in analysis of sacred texts and religious practice around men and men's experiences as if universal. By centering women's voices and experiences in the way the primary texts are understood and adjudicated, the whole rubric of patriarchal hegemony was upset. Islamic feminism takes into consideration the epistemology of textual analysis by constructing gender as a category of thought. This had never been a conscious part of feminist analysis and critique before the end of the 20th century. Instead, Muslim women and men who identified with feminism identified with the dominant imperialistic feminisms of the global north. For whatever merits these previously existing feminisms might offer, the potential for rejection among slave Muslims was forestalled when the methodology for gender reforms was drawn from Islamic sources without the patriarchal readings of the past. In the past, classical Islamic intellectual traditions operated within a well-entrenched patriarchal model, taking for granted that men were the ideal agents and that they were superior to women as a matter of cosmology, theology, epistemology, and praxis. Men were in charge, and women were here to support men's movement towards the divine. To be sure, Islamic classical thought expressed the general understanding promoted in the Quran and by the Prophet, upon him be peace, that women are fully human. Simultaneously, patriarchal interpretations and implementations subtracted from women's full humanity at almost every turn. Patriarchy is not the subject of my discussion here, but as the elephant in the room, I will indicate how I understand it in order to show why it is not the focus. To focus on patriarchy distracts from the task I have taken up over a lifetime and once again centers the discussion around men, men's ways of knowing, being, or doing. Patriarchy gives privilege to men over centuries of the human movement to manifest its highest earthly potential. Patriarchy is constructed around an inherent inequality in human relationships. It was encoded first by actions and social structures and justified in Hellenistic philosophy. In Hellenistic philosophy, each person has a place in society, namely free, citizen, and male over slaves, non-citizens, and female. Some places are higher than others, including some placed as slaves to serve others placed as masters. The presumption that a slave is equal to a master in all ways was unfathomable, and as such was justification for the institution of slavery. So patriarchy is not just a gender construct. However, in application to gender, it mandates a hegemony based on privileging cis men over all others, including women. So let me just say a little bit about how Islamic feminist exegesis is developed through the Quran, starting with the cosmology. In Islamic cosmology, humans descend from a single nefs, which is soul, self, or being. Nefs is feminine grammatically, but it is used for the essence of the sentient being, whether male, female, or non-binary. It has been translated as soul or self, although there are other words for soul in Arabic. Since the word nefs is also used in the Quran for the creator, who is not a being at all, it should not be seen as a substitute for human, except in the way the creation story is told. All of humankind descends from a single nafs, according to the explicit Quranic pronouncement. Inni ja'ilun fil ardi, khalaqnakum min nafsin wahida. Indeed, we, the divine we, have created you from a single soul, nafsin wahida. The Quran does not state that the human sojourn on the earth starts with a male person, or even with the nafs of a male person. It is taken for granted that the first human was Adam, just as it is taken for granted that Adam was a male person. However, even prior to this human creation, in the Quran assures us, from all things, we, the divine we, have created pairs. Min kulli shayin khalaqna zawjayn. Thus, male and female are equally essential to the ontological design. Every created thing participates in the binary at some level, but not necessarily with hegemony. Quranic cosmology does not include an original sin, which was then assigned as the fault of woman. The language of Quranic cosmology uses the unique Arabic dual form and is therefore inclusive. The two ate of the fruit, the two disobeyed Allah, the two sinned. However, scriptural exegesis at the time of the revelation of the Quran often came from Christian and Jewish exegesis of their previous sacred texts. This includes encoding hegemonic reading of the first human as male and the first sinner as female. When applied to Quranic analysis throughout the centuries, this asymmetrical gendered reading was taken for granted by Muslim scholars and laypersons for centuries. The first time I received a letter threatening my death was after a public lecture in which I debunked the rib story. Someone had admired my analysis and written an editorial in one of the main newspapers. In response to that editorial, someone else left a letter in my Islamic University campus mailbox. It said, if I believed that there's no rib story, then that means that I believe something that I had not said, which according to the letter writer is a sign of apostasy, and the punishment for apostasy is death. In other words, the letter writer was interpreting my interpretation of the fact that there is no rib story in the Quran. His or her interpretation was then made analogous with apostasy, the punishment for which is death. And even that is an interpretive reading, not agreed upon by all schools of jurisprudence, although here it was stated as if it had complete consensus. The prevailing idea among Muslims is that the man, Adam, was put to sleep and a woman, Eve or Hawa, was extracted from under his heart. None of these details are in the Quranic story of cosmology. So this is another example of why it is important to reread the text from a gender perspective. Such a reading challenges certain entrenched ideas and leads to the production of new knowledge. The significance of knowledge production cannot be overstated, especially as related to a religious ethos, which includes a revelatory text. Most Muslims expect only to receive religious knowledge that descends from a sacred and unknown source. In Muslim history, an elite class of interpreters would evolve and eventually be elevated to a level of near infallibility, despite structural prohibition against such a reading throughout all of Muslim intellectual history. More vexing is that this elitism denies women's scholarship even when seeking knowledge was incumbent upon women. Women were denied the right to learn, women were not denied the right to learn, to think, to speak, except for the imposition of patriarchy in culture. Thus, Muslim majority countries have had lower rates of literacy amongst women than many other countries in the modern world. These limitations cannot be said to be based on the Quran or the Sunnah. Despite the universal mandate for women to seek knowledge as an integral, even mandatory part of Islam, women's ways of knowing were not substantial in the establishment of the operating paradigms of Islamic thought and praxis. For example, a hadith of the Prophet says, seeking knowledge is incumbent upon every Muslim, male and female. Eventually, women's subjective knowledge was deemed incongruent with truth or orthodoxy, while men apparently had no subjectivity and their knowledge was canonized as if sacred or divine. Islamic feminist reforms have returned all interpreters to their status as mere humans struggling to understand and to implement divine mandates. You cannot imagine how hard it is to disengage men's subjectivities from the copious, often erudite and eloquent construction of Islamic thought. The moment women seek authority through knowledge production, their full humanity can suffer challenges by being chastised as disbelievers, heretics, even enemies to Islam. Notice how often Muslim women attach words like believer or practicing to themselves and their intellectual production or activism. To engage in textual analysis from a male perspective is sacrosanct and scholarly, but to engage textual analysis from a female perspective is heretical, even evil. Male and female are not closed categories. All that is masculine is not male. All that is feminine is not female. All that is male is not masculine. And all that is female is not feminine. Rather, feminine and masculine form a spectrum between 2 points, often described as female and male, but which are merely binary abstract possibilities. I identify as non-binary because my feminine aspects operate in a constant dynamic relationship with my masculine aspects. Within the spectrum of possibilities, reality is never exclusive nor, sorry, I literally cannot read that, nor absolute. All humans fall within this binary spectrum with both masculine and feminine attributes, aspects, and essences. Gender is a construct. During the foundational discourses of Islamic thought, men dominated the discussion and encoded their own humanity as total and comparable for both women and men. Men became the measure of what it means to be human. The achievement of excellence as a human was often constructed to belong exclusively to men, and yet, even then, not all men. Men who were servants, travelers, indigents, or not the same ethnicity, color, race, religion, and sexual expression were, like all women, also considered deficient in their full humanity. According to Hellenistic philosophy, this was good and just. The differences between the male and the female were presumed to operate within a necessary hegemony with differential treatment and analysis as natural and necessary. If any two beings came together, one must be better than the other. Therefore, men were better. Patriarchy follows a logic of hegemony. In my work, I've advocated a move beyond the flawed logic of hegemony towards a horizontal logic of reciprocity and equality. And I will elaborate on this a little bit later under the term Tawheed. Through textual analysis from a gender perspective of Quranic cosmology, I constructed a new epistemology of human equality. Starting with the human purpose or teleology, the Quran states, I will make on the earth an agent, inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa. A khalifa is a moral agent. There's no original sin that caused the fall to the earth. Earth was always the goal and the place where the human agent fulfills their purpose. As agents on the earth, establishing justice is mandatory. However, as Islamic feminist ethics has unpacked, there were many ways in which agency was given completely to some men and only partially to women. Women's agency was best articulated as a completion of men's agency. Otherwise, women were often considered a primary deterrent to men fulfilling their agency. Excuse me. For example, Zahra Ayubi, in her recent book, Gendered Morality in 2019, gives a thorough analysis of how the primary architecture of Muslim philosophy, built upon Hellenistic thought, confirmed that men are full moral beings and women, while endowed with a soul, are never able to aspire to the completion of the highest moral excellence. In Saadia Sheikh's book, Sufi Narratives of Intimacy from 2012, she elaborates how even in the mystical traditions of Islam, this hegemony was in operation by discussing a notable exception, Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, a 12th century Andalusian philosopher and mystic. He was one of the first Muslim intellectuals to integrate women into the discourse about the highest human potential, al-insan al-kamil. While Ibn Arabi practiced what he preached through a legacy of following women as spiritual teachers, as well as behind them in ritual prayer, he also supported some of the standard patriarchal rubrics of his day. During the 8th to 13th century Abbasid dynasty, women's voices would be almost totally silenced in Islamic knowledge production. The roles women performed to complete their humanity were not considered agency, especially in jurisprudence. This left a gaping hole, rendering people like Ibn Arabi rare exceptions to the rule of male privilege. A few small voices did not change the formula that was tantamount to a sacred mandate. Still today, excuse me, the active inclusion of women's realities is undervalued in the estimation of the human sojourn from the perspective of male Islamic scholars. Recently, Keisha Ali of 2013 enumerated the exclusions of women scholars in the citation of almost all Muslim male scholars, even when the discussion is related to matters of women and gender. Excuse me. When we say women and men are equal, many Muslims take this to mean women want to be men. Even here, the men are the standard by which women make their aspirations. Another example is when the Sufi hagiographer Attar justified the inclusion of the name of the most famous female mystic of love, Rabi al-Adawiyya, who died in 801, in his biography of the saints. He said, whoever reaches the level of spiritual acumen as Rabia, he didn't say ceases to be a woman, but I added that, ceases to be a woman. In other words, she is counted among the men, implying that the higher a person goes on the scale of spirituality, the more male they become. The measurement of one's humanity, ethics, spirituality, and agency are based upon the idealized location for men. Women can never measure up against this because they are their own measurement. The idea that women should be their own measurement has taken some time to be promoted for critical analysis of Islamic sources. As we left the 20th century, scholarship and activism had taken a radical paradigm shift. Women's agency, creativity, spirituality, and scholarship are part of the landscape. Even where there are still many places where this is in opposition. Muslim women's voices and agency have reached a critical mass such that we will not be turned back despite efforts to that effect. I've spent almost 50 years in Quranic analysis while never wishing to become a man. I am a woman interested in equality. From my PhD dissertation, I projected the idea of reading for the absence of sex role stereotyping in the Quran, a reading that stands in juxtaposition to scholars and activists who give precedent to those Quranic statements that repeat the prevailing gender hegemony at the time of revelation as if they are the core of the Quran, over statements that participate in equality and reciprocity at the highest level. While hegemony is confirmed as a matter within social and historical context, Islamic feminist readings give precedent to statements that affirm the ethics of equality and reciprocity. While Islamic feminist exegesis and activism affirms the personal in their own reading, indicating the ways that male scholars of the past had ignored their personal reading, was, in fact, a strategic political move. The Quran is not only prescriptive, it is descriptive. In the Quranic worldview, the epistemological rhetoric of othering is absent. I have addressed all of the hegemonic statements in the Quran for my scholarship and activism, but I have not taken them as the standard by which I measure the entire Quran. What does it take to establish the Quranic construction of gender equality as the central rubric of understanding all of the Quran, in fact, all of Islam? Then how do we establish this equality for its ethical implementations? This question aligns Islamic theology with the lived realities of Muslim women. So I developed a theological perspective on gender equality over the past 2 decades. I started with a critical reading of the introductory chapter to Sachika Maratha's excellent book, The Tao of Islam. The book accurately depicts the logic of traditional Sufism about complementarity in male-female relationships, including eloquent analogies like the sky and the earth, or the pen and the tablet. However, these traditional analogs confirm only one active direction, resulting in unequal relationships. The sky lets down to the earth. The pen writes onto the tablet. Sky and pen are the exclusive active agents, making earth and tablet only receptive. Thus, the male is not like the female. The graphic depiction shows Allah on the top, and the male in the middle, and the female at the bottom. The sky, earth, and pen tablet analogies confirm that there is only one active direction, down. The depiction presents another problem for me, however, and that was that there is no direct, unmitigated relationship between Allah at the top and the female at the bottom. The male in the middle interferes with that direct relationship. For while the male receives directly from Allah and even acts directly upon the female, there is a separation between Allah and the female in that model. She cannot receive directly from or interact directly with Allah because the male is in the way. As a result, the relationship between her and the male is unequal or asymmetrical. The most astounding aspect of the fallacy of this vertical logic, replicated throughout all of the normative Islamic cosmology, philosophy, and theology from the classical period, is that it prevents the required direct relationship between Allah and each human, no matter the gender, gender expression, or gender identity. A direct relationship without intermediary is fundamental in Islamic theology. The vertical model, while accurately depicting the worldview of classical thought, culture, and practice, could not express the full range of Islamic theology. In reference to Martin Buber's I Thou and I It ethical formula, I thus re-envision Islamic ethics according to a reciprocal model. The new graphic was like a triangle. Allah was on the topmost point, putting the male and the female as 2 points on a horizontal line. Allah is omnipresent, however, and not limited to one fixed point. The coherence of constructing a graphic representation pinpoints Allah as the highest point, but it is not meant to capture Allah as if only at that single point. The graphic was necessary to demonstrate the difference between the hegemonic idealized cosmology of classical thought and the Tawhidic expression of Islamic feminist thought. The fixed locations of Allah in this graphic is a mere metaphorical depiction. The new model tackled the pervasive patriarchal thinking with men on top, superior to, or in charge of women and non-elite others. I call it the Tawhidic paradigm because it is built upon the indisputable and fundamental theological principle of Islam called Tawheed. Tawheed means Allah is one and unique. It is derived from the second form of the verb and is thus dynamic. Allah unites. To depict Allah on the top as the highest metaphysical reality then places the female and the male on the line of horizontal reciprocity. Therefore, they must be equal to affirm the oneness of Allah. All who claim to believe in Tawheed and who wish to live in surrender to Allah, which by the way is another word for the word Islam, must operate in such a way that the divine reality of one is expressed in all human-to-human relationships only with reciprocity and equality. This theological understanding invites us all to make application in the context of social justice. No matter the basis, whether sexuality, race, class, religion, ethnicity, geography, etc., anyone who participates in the hegemonic logic violates the principle of Tawheed, which is fundamental to Islam and which grants supremacy only to Allah. Divine unicity demands gender equality. However, despite the Tawhidic theological framework, classic Islamic discourse maintained a pervasive hegemonic binary logic. In the Quranic cosmology, the story of Satan provides a clue. Iblis was a jinn, an unseen being created of smokeless fire. Unlike angels, jinn have free will with which they can choose to surrender to Allah or disobey, like humans. When Iblis was ordered to bow down to the original human person, nefs or soul, he refused, saying, I am better than he. He was created from an atom of dirt or teen, and I was created from smokeless fire. The Arabic word for this is istikbar, to make oneself better than another. This corresponds to the I-it of Martin Buber. In Islamic feminist interpretation of Quranic cosmology, inequality results from thinking of oneself as better than another. Furthermore, istikbar is the root of all zulm, systemic oppression, such that one group imagines itself to have power over another. In the Quran, Allah is omnipotent, but does not oppress. Oppression or zulm is not a divine quality. It is a form of arrogance and therefore ungodly. Quranic language, syntax, and metaphor is absent of the rhetoric of hegemonic juxtaposition on the basis of human-to-human characteristics and diversity. In the Quran, the only qualification of preference is based on the twin rubric of faith and good deeds. The highest ethical term in the Quran is taqwa. Taqwa is both the moral consciousness that results from awareness of divine consequence or faith, and the ethical action or deeds that results from the compassion this consciousness leads to. The Quran is explicit. The most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the one with the most taqwa. Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. So when the Quran does make note of characteristics of persons placed situationally in elevation over others, these are descriptive passages. The Quran is descriptive and prescriptive. Another feature of feminist exegesis is limiting descriptive passages to a particular past while encoding prescriptive passages into their universal benefit across time. Rhetorical hegemony accounts for a manifest I-it social construct through a satanic consciousness. The statements confirming existing hegemonies are not the subject of Quranic prescription. So now let's look at lived reality as a methodology for legal reform. Thus, patriarchy, while pervasive, was merely the faulty logic of a hegemonic binary. The radical construction of Islamic theology and cosmology by Islamic feminist scholarship forms an important part of the solution to dismantle gender inequality by direct reference to Islamic primary sources. However, it is merely the theoretical foundation which insists upon a critical reading of gender. It needs to be radically in conversation with praxis, as established by activist organizations like Sisters in Islam in Malaysia and the Global Movement for Reform and Muslim Family, Musawa. Because the interpretive logic of the Tawhidic paradigm mandates equality as built directly from Islam's most sacred text, it is Islamic in source and construct. It does not merely mimic other feminisms, even when used by Muslims. For while the Quranic ideals overlap some earlier feminist ideas regarding the full human dignity of women, in Islamic feminism, the particulars of the intra-Quranic worldview are used over selective and exclusivist models of feminism. Muslims have participated in, added to, and advanced through other forms of feminism even before they were challenged for their lack of intersectionality. Islamic feminism is distinct from earlier Muslim feminisms by its methodology. It cannot be said to belong to all Muslim feminist methodologies. Furthermore, the application of the Tawhidic theological paradigm to policy moved the efficacy of Islamic feminism to a new and unprecedented level. The theology could only be derived directly from Islamic primary sources, unfettered by centuries of hegemonic thinking or by the privileging of feminisms from the global north. In the context of the modern nation state, Islamic feminist methodology challenges the habit of justifying certain ideas about unequal status and disparate access to full dignity before the law in the name of Islam. Then the history of Islamic law comes into consideration. The Islamic legal system starts with a foundational idea called Sharia, the path that leads to the source of life, or water. It is used as the way of Allah, the fulfillment of the divine will and the correct path, straight and mandatory. One of the most intense intellectual developments across Muslim time and place was the development of the ideas about Sharia as a particular Muslim jurisprudence. Eventually, recognized scholars of the law were ascribed unconditional authority, even over matters about which they had no firsthand information, because they were almost all male. Dismantling male privilege in Islamic law not only requires a critical reread of gender, but also a comprehensive application of that critical read to the ways in which patriarchal laws are confirmed within the context of the modern nation-state mechanisms. One important legacy of colonialism was allowing Muslim majority states or states with sizable Muslim minorities to determine their own personal status or family law through local customs or religion. Thus, patriarchy became encoded in the law of the land, where it remains even until today, despite other political rubrics of democracy and change. The next crucial development of Islamic feminism was taking gender-inclusive interpretation along the lines of the Tawhidic paradigm into application to advocate for reform in law and policy. This is where context is used to determine the correct application of the text. Taking into consideration women's lived realities as a key element for the just application of Islamic law. These reinterpretive models are linked with the pervasive understanding underlining all disciplines in the Islamic intellectual tradition, and that is justice. That justice is fundamental and universal. However, Islamic feminists ask, if a law is just, how are unjust laws perpetuated in the name of Allah? It was difficult to unpack the patriarchal privileging of Islamic law and disentangle it from the state. First, a distinction had to be made between the classical idea of law, called Sharia, and the state. And the distinction, I'm sorry, the text is so small. The distinction between what is actually interpretation of the divine way or fiqh. Fiqh is the human understanding of the right path or divine will. Not only is it completely human, it's also specific. As such, it needs to be continually considered across time and place in order to complete its ultimate mandate, how to justly adhere to a path that leads to Allah. Fiqh is what has been put into practice at the level of the state. Although it is often erroneously called Islamic law or even Sharia or the divine way. As Abdullahi and Naeem pointed out in 2008, humans can never implement divine law. They can only implement the human estimation of the goals, methods, and objectives of the divine in accordance to the practicalities of their interpretation and context. I am now at 44 minutes. And paying attention to the time, I'm going to make a quick summary of where we go from here. And that is to say that Islamic feminist preoccupation with knowledge production prioritizes the impact of certain interpretations on the real lives of women. As a consequence, there has to be a dynamic conversation between activism on the ground, really working with women's realities and their experiences relative to how the state implements what is called Islamic law, especially with regard to the family. There are some interesting implications for this in terms of a new area of study on queer Islamic theology, but I won't have a chance to go into it, except to say that there is classical Islamic ulum al-Quran or sciences of the Quran that have been put into a radical reintegration. Things like the relationship between qat'i or specific passages and dhanni or ambiguous passages, and how ambiguous passages may actually allow for the liminal spaces where, for example, non-binary people do exist, but also taking the khas or the specific and making them universal was a habit of the past, whereas now we want to take the am, the general, and we want to project them into the universal on the grounds of Tawheed. So in other words, the process of interpretation and application is ongoing, and I would love to detail more of this during the question and answer session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Amina, for this clear, eye-opening and comprehensive talk. And I really like how your talk center the concept of social justice and center real-world experiences of women. I'm sure many of us have lots of questions now. Please do use the virtual hand in the team somewhere at the bottom of the team chat to ask your questions. Otherwise, you can also use the chat function also at the bottom of the team's screen. We'll give it a few minutes for questions. I'm sure audience are thinking of this, and we'll ask maybe a question. Okay, we have 2 questions, and then I can come to me as well. So we have, let's go to Nicola and then Anthony.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amina. I learned so much from your talk. So my question is really, I mean, the philosophy of Islamic feminism is very rich, and as Malaka said, I mean, by centering justice, this is so positive. But I'm just wondering then how Islamic feminists are then, what happens in the real world when Islamic feminists have to deal with those people who refuse this philosophy and who have power to, you know, to override, if you like, these very important claims and understandings. Yeah, I wanted to hear a bit more about how this is playing out in practice in the contexts in which you have experience. Thanks.
Should I answer each question one by one? I prefer rather than to take 2 or 3.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, maybe that is okay. Yeah.
Yeah, because my note taking is really bad. I love this question, and unfortunately, it's a whole lecture, so I'm going to try to make it concise. The Musawa movement, www.musawa.org, was launched in 2009 based on previous experiences working in the national group of Sisters in Islam and in collaboration with other Muslim women's organizations worldwide. And that's what I meant by what's happening when the state adjudicates on the basis of a certain kind of understanding of Islam, and that one being very hegemonic and patriarchal. So what Musawa has been doing, and they have quite a comprehensive connection to other organizations and to you know, a number of states, is to combine this knowledge production, this Islamic feminist knowledge production that is interrogating sacred texts from a gender inclusive perspective with the constitution of those nation states, and also with the international instruments like CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, because almost all of the Muslim majority states and the Muslim minority states with large populations of Muslims have signed CEDAW. And CEDAW has certain articulations with regard to equality and reciprocity that the states will often hold reservations against. And Musawa has been challenging this at the UN for a number of years now. And finally, the UN is actually starting to listen, because what is happening is that we are taking only the most conservative patriarchal interpretations of Islam and saying that is Islam. And we have been challenging that actually for 30 years with Sisters in Islam. And so what happens is in application, it's really on a case-by-case basis. In other words, there's a framework. You can look at the Musawa website. They do, you know, put out their entire methodology, and they do give quite a vast amount of data to support, you know, the progress that's been made. But on a case-by-case basis, what you find is that certain issues come up in certain nation states, say, for example, child marriage. And we approach the particular issue with this Tawhidic framework. I also say on the basis of that Tawhidic framework, in order for Islam to be implemented in the context of the constitution that most Muslim countries have, women have to have full equality. You can't have a set of rules for women that distract from their access to resources and the production of knowledge. And so there's so much exciting work that's going on. And I just want to say, as a little bit of a sidebar, when I came into Malaysia, more than 30 years ago, I was all in theory and theology, and it was like just this sublime world. But then the task of responding to lived reality was such a huge challenge and a benefit for me in my work, because then it meant that the ideal could be made applicable, but you must deal with the particulars that are happening on the ground in each of the states. So Musawa is a movement, it's not an organization. And the reason is because you have to respond to the particulars in various nation states, however they're being manifest.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Amina. Thank you, Dr. Nicola, for the question. I know that we have Anthony who raised his hand, but I can't see Anthony here.
I'm here.
Okay, you're here. Okay, excellent.
Sorry, my connection got broken for a moment. Sorry, again, Dr. Wadud, thank you very much. Very clear presentation, very interesting. Sort of, to some extent, what Nicholas said, I want to build on that. You've concentrated on the Quran, of course, and perhaps also you mentioned in passing the Sharia, but I'm just thinking the practicalities of the Islamic sources. People don't just make scholars or ulama and so forth, fuqaha don't just make decisions on the Quran alone. They make it on the Hadith, and they make it, and that's what produces fiqh and Sharia and everything. And in the Hadith, I would say that aren't there many traditions, like even Bukhari, like for example about the one about them with the majority of the inhabitants of hell being women, and or about nothing more after me I've not left anything more affliction more harmful to men than women. Aren't there many kind of hard attitudes to women in the Hadith which would prevent in the practical sphere an Islamic feminism being realized in societies? I don't know if you're a Quran only person, but perhaps you could just elaborate on that. Thank you.
Yes, I'm not a Quran only person. I am an expert in the Quran because I had to make only one choice to get a PhD. However, I work in relationship to the network of Musawa, and we do have experts on the Hadith, and we do have other experts on the Quran, and we have experts on fiqh. As well as experts on CEDAW and Constitution. We have a network. So we work on all of these. In fact, I had a wonderful experience teaching in Indonesia about 12 years ago. I had a student who has now written what I consider to be the source text of the gender reading of Hadith. It's called Mubadila something in Bahasa, but his name is Faqih-ud-Din. It is possible to also do a gender reading of Hadith. There's some amazing work by also Dr. Zahia Jawiru from Tunisia. She was part of the construction of the new constitution for Tunisia after the revolution. She is one of our resource persons. We just came off of a workshop 2 weeks ago, so all this stuff is fresh in my mind. So although it's not my area, I work in relationship to people for whom there has been a great deal of work done. So we don't leave any ground unturned. Coincidentally, the citation of that particular hadith is really questionable on the lips of any person, let alone pretending that it belongs to the prophet. However, she also does an amazing, Dr. Jawiru does an amazing analysis of that and of some other interesting issues like what's the word, inheritance, which is sort of a combination of Quranic and fiqh reanalysis. So we don't leave any ground unturned. I have my own area of expertise, which happens to be in the Quran. And I work in communities with people who have experts in other areas. So it's quite comprehensive. I do invite you to visit the Musawa website because it's a cornucopia of information, very well resourced, but also it actually lets you know what's happening on the ground and what the nation states have been able to make increments of progress or leaps and bounds, like the Mudawina for Morocco, and how they are arguing with regard to these particular concerns, and then again, the relationship to the international human rights instruments.
Thank you, Dr. Amina. We have a question from Amal Hamami, who is also from Tunisia. Yeah, given that you mentioned Tunisia.
Thank you, Professor, for this thought-provoking lecture, and thank you, my friend Malaka, for the moderation of this session. So, because the word inheritance is very sensitive for Tunisian women, so I would like to ask Professor Wadud about like very specific question about the inheritance equality, because we know that the principle or the objective of inheritance laws is to organize one of the aspects of the relation between citizens. And in our gender biased world, this relation overburden the weaker part, I mean here women. And usually the state legislator should intervene to balance and rationalize this practice of passing legacy. However, in the Islamic countries, the inheritance law is deemed divine or a supra-legislative and an immutable rule. So here, I would like to ask, how could we establish a real equal inheritance rights based on Quran's verses and Islamic history, knowing that inheritance law is a human-made law or a practice that was upgraded to religious rule. This law is revocable as compared to the irrevocable rules related to devotions in Quran and in Islam. Also because each time has its logic, and women, the role of women, the social and economic role of women is not the same as before 15th century. Thank you.
Yes, all of the above. Dr. Zahia Jawiro is at Zaytuna University, and you should definitely look her up and her work. She's very well published. She's also a public figure, so she's done quite a bit of work specifically on inheritance. What we have to do is get away from the notion that the inheritance laws as they are implemented in the context of the nation state are divine laws. They are not. They are human-made laws, and they are constructed on the basis of a certain understanding that literally ignores certain parts of the Quran in its conversation about the principle of inheritance, specifically going to women. So it's a very long and detailed argument. It's not my argument, so I can't make it into a synopsis, but suffices to say that what Dr. Zahia provides is a comprehensive reading about the exchange of wealth, to have an understanding of what its meaning might be, and look at the places in the Quran where there are certain details, as opposed to certain places in the Quran where there are certain ellipses or absences that people have filled in with a certain presumption of a strict formula, which she indicates by her analysis is not a consistent application of the Quranic objective. So it's very elaborate, but she's doing it, and she's doing it at the level of the state, and it has the future impact in Tunisia first, actually, because she is working with certain parts of the state with regard to it. So, I'm sorry that I wish I could just, do a quick thumbnail synopsis of it, because it's beautiful. And every time she does it, I just think, wow, that's just so amazing. I'm so happy with it. But it wasn't something that I created. So I'm always going in secondary knowledge. But it's a very coherent, logical reading. And it does take into consideration, what's happening at the state, But you have to remember what I said earlier with regard to the state. The state is not implementing Islam. The state is implementing an interpretation of Islam. And those interpretations of Islam have to do with, sort of hegemonic, neoconservative, patriarchal interpretation of the sources like the Quran. And what we're doing with Musawa is to try to break that and to go back to the Quran and to have Islam become something that is adjudicated by the people, for the people, and women are amongst those people. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Amal, for the question, and thank you, Dr. Amina, for this answer. So we'll get into Sally now for a question from the audience.
Well, hello. Thank you so much for your engaging talk, Dr. Amina. I have got two short questions. My first question has to do with the difference between women's rights and feminism. And I'm asking this question because in the 1997 documentary, 4 Women of Egypt, about 4 women who are feminists in Egypt and with opposing religious, social, and political views at the time. Some of them rejected the term feminism when interviewed and asked about it, and they said that they prefer to use the term women's rights. So I'm wondering if we still need to distinguish between these two terms, or if it's okay to conflate them or just use feminism rather than women's rights. So that's one thing. I mean, which one would be more accurate, or is this difference just minimal? And then the other question has to do with women during the Middle Ages and their contributions, which are all over the place. How can we, when we address these women and when we address their works and when we try to analyze them, how can we, or which term can we apply? Can we still apply Islamic feminism to their obvious presence and visible presence during the Middle Ages and their contributions? Or what would be a good way of theorizing that, knowing that we cannot easily foist modern theory on the Middle Ages and so on? And that's a question I have on mind because I'm a medievalist myself and I work on medieval texts and sometimes on women as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you for this interesting question. I especially like the part about the medieval. Let me get to the first part first. I'm only a feminist myself for about 10 or 11 years. And that is because I was bombarded with the hegemonic expressions of feminism, which in my mind were antithetical to my faith journey. Eventually, I used to say I'm pro-faith, pro-feminist. But then when this rubric of Islamic feminism came along, I really felt my niche. So let me go back and repeat what I said, in my presentation in a shorter form. Islamic feminism takes to task not only the word feminism, but also the word Islam. And if those two things are not understood as a, sort of a hybrid contribution to the discourses of both Islam and feminism, then you won't understand it. You will always be talking about the numbers of women who still, like myself in the 12, 13 years ago and many years before that, absolutely refuse the term. So I am very sympathetic to people who don't want to use the term, and actually it's not something that I feel that everyone needs to attach themselves to in order to do the more important work, and that is gender equality. I'm not even going to say, what did you call it? Women's rights. Yeah, I'm not even going to do that because it's also about the rights of men. And that has to do with how it is do we think about, the difference between, the words for male and female and the word gender. I mean, they're not the same thing. So the term is not important, but the term is also a consequence of a historical debate. And that historical debate did indeed start a long time after the medieval period, which is semi-answer to your second part of the question. And that was a debate that necessitated a critical reread of, all kinds of texts, all kinds of research, all kinds of studies, all kinds of practices and the like. And so it has a history, and within that history, it has evolved through different waves. And according to those waves, it has arrived at a place where intersectionality is now a fundamental part of it. But that was not always a fundamental part of it, and that hence my problem with it previously, especially as a Black woman. But when it came to the matter of religion and culture, unfortunately, it seemed to me that it was even more difficult to dismantle the perspective. So let's get to the other part of the term, to dismantle the perspective that Islam or other religions or all religions were patriarchal. And that is because they would apply this principle of feminism to everything, to medicine, to science, to philosophy, to theology, but they would just sort of leave off the interrogation of the very notion of the divine that people are carrying in their heads and how that goes forward in application to culture, and in the case of Islam, particularly to the law. So we really had to see what was the trajectory that went into each aspect of it. And Margot Badran has talked about 3 different waves of Muslim feminisms, because Muslim feminisms did not start off as Islamic feminisms, even though in my estimation, it has evolved to that point. And as it has evolved, not all feminists, not all Muslim feminists are Islamic feminists. Some of them are secular feminists by choice. That's what they want. They want to keep the state out of the matter. And so what do we do? And I think that's an important part of your question. What do we do with women who are actively engaged in women's rights who do not want to be identified with the term feminism? And that is, we permit them to identify and represent themselves. There's no requirement that you have to use the term feminism. I use the term feminism now in the hybridity with which I've seen it evolve to the level of Islamic feminism. And that's why I say, what's in a name, it's much more important for me that all persons work towards the full rights and dignity of all other persons. So, it doesn't matter what you call yourself. So the short answer for the second part of the question, which in fact is quite interesting, is, do we call the work that was done by women at earlier points feminism? People actually even call the Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace, feminist. I don't. I'm using the historical evolution of the phenomena, philosophy and methodology, as well as activism of feminism. And unfortunately, it doesn't go back to the medieval period or to the time of the Prophet. However, strategically, when you're doing your research, you can use feminism as an adjective to describe, and then you determine what the parameters of it is. Because for me, feminism is the radical notion that women are full human beings. And for me, the understanding of a full human being comes from the Quran. It's cosmology, eschatology, and worldview. So that means that you could say that it was feminist, but you could not identify those persons who did things in the medieval period as feminists because they didn't identify themselves that way. So that's a kind of interesting way that you might want to play around with the terms.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful.
Thank you, Sally. And I did have the same question that Sally asked, actually, the first question. So that was, yeah, a good question. So we have Caroline, and then we have 2 questions in the chat function. So Caroline, do you want to go ahead and ask your question, please?
Just unmuting myself. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Amina, so much for that important talk. One thing in particular that was interesting me is relates to something that I've been trying to work on with some difficulty, which is the question of how one might talk of a reality of gender beyond gender as a construct, because it's so widely accepted that gender is a construct, and that if you want to posit a spiritual or ontological reality to gender, I find one comes up against the question of language, because everything that you say will be said to be, but that is a construct. But also what interests me here, and you've already begun to touch on questions of this, is that if, in terms of gender as a reality, there's a kind of dynamism and fluidity, which also makes the question of a language difficult. And I was very struck by the helpful diagram you had of Allah, male and female, but in the triangle, and you spoke of it as metaphoric, and I found that very interesting, because for me the whole question of trying to address a spiritual reality of gender leads me to think about more poetic forms of language, and I wondered if you could say something about this.
Yes, such a lovely thought, actually. I'm interested in, when I talk about the Tawhidic paradigm, in most cases I have this lovely graphic that over time many wonderful people have helped me towards. But it is one to dismantle the othering. And gender is but one part of that. However, I do go through the yin yang of the Far Eastern cosmologies, because it is a dynamic expression of the necessary interrelationship between the two. So for me, I actually, in the new graphics, I actually have this happen on the line, where you eventually you understand that we are but the mirror of another person, and that the identity of that person doesn't have to be fixed, for example, in a cisgender kind of constructed reality, right? So I am very interested in it, and like you, I definitely think that our languages prohibit us from, at the same time, expressing the binary without hegemony, while at the same time trying to make the distinctions that happen in real people. So I'm anything that you have along those lines, if you wish to share with me later, I would definitely love to read it, because I find that the only way that I feel that I can do it right now is that I identify as non-binary. And that's because I am looking, right now I'm looking at the divine feminine in Islam, and to look at the divine names of Allah that are feminine, and people, sometimes their heads explode because we are so entrenched in the male God. And I think we're also entrenched in a bifurcation between male and female, such that we can't see that all of us have masculine and all of us have feminine, until we try to problematize it with certain rubrics of puritanical morality. So I think it's a beautiful notion. I'm not giving you an answer, I'm giving you a response, because I respect very much what the implications are, and I don't have a fixed answer. I'm still working it out, but I think you're absolutely right. I definitely agree that it's something that we need to pursue further. Thank you.
Thanks, that's really helpful.
Thank you so very much. And I love that this conversation is creating hopefully more spaces for discussion beyond this conversation. So hopefully Caroline and Dr. Amina can speak after this discussion. I do have 2 questions in the chat from Kali and Asha, and maybe I will ask each one of them one by one, just to make it easier for Dr. Amina. So Kali and Asha said, thank you, Dr. Amina, for this thoughtful and rich lecture. We have 2 questions, if there is time. Could you share some comments on how you approach questions and race and hegemony in Islamic feminist methodology? Shall I ask the other question as well, or do you prefer?
Yes, it's just one person, go ahead.
Okay, sure. And the other one is, how do you see Islamic feminism travels and carries meanings in other worlds, languages, outside of English-speaking academic centers? Thanks and respect from Kali and Asha.
Yes, 2 interesting questions, actually. First of all, the discourses of Islamic feminism, pretends to be sort of the latest iteration of the affirmation of the need for intersectionality. In other words, it is not just gender, There are other things that form rubrics of oppression. And so therefore, you know, it's supposed to include race, and I as a Black woman like to pretend that it does. But there are the problems of those persons whose internalized white supremacy has not been challenged. So they may identify themselves as Islamic feminism for certain reasons, but they fail to deal with that. And that's why for me, the rubric is about understanding self and other. So it includes those things. I do want to say this, although you didn't ask it, but I have to, because this is where I'm going, you know, in the most immediate phase of my research, soul search and advocacy. And that is that for the most part, I haven't seen Islamic feminists deal constructively with matters of gender non-binary identities and LGBTQI. So it is going to be sexuality as a part of the gender rubric. To me, that's going to be more tenacious than race. And that is simply anecdotal. I don't, you know, I haven't collected data in order to be able to, you know, to support that. I also know, I just had an interesting conversation about this as a, you know, a Black American Muslim woman. I also know that the, at least the Black Muslim context in the United States is very conservative. And I have no clue when it's going to get at a place where it's going to accept any form of feminism, let alone this particular hybridity. So there might be things that will come into discussion. However, there has to be a discussion. In other words, there has to be a consideration of race, class, gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, ableism, and the like, in order to determine the places where there may be gaps in the expression of something, just because it quote unquote coins a new set of phraseologies combining Islam and feminism to make Islamic feminism, as opposed to Muslims who are feminists. Because as I say, some of them are secular, some of them are anti-religion, you know? So I think that I'm hopeful for an engaged conversation over time. And I would be alert to any places where there is a fallacy in the expressions of Islamic feminism, such a way that they participate in white supremacy. But so far that discussion has not happened. And I don't know what will make that discussion happen. It's just that myself, as a Black woman who is also an Islamic feminist, I'm intersectional in terms of my projections. So I do bring certain things in, but that doesn't mean I am the lead of all the discussions to such an extent that I can say that there will not occur this problem. So I'm holding off. I'm holding space for it. A problem that I have seen has to do with non-heteronormative sexuality. So that's a problem for me. The languages, to be frank, the gender jihad in discourse is predominated by English. And because it's my mother tongue, it's not a challenge for me in that that is what you see when you look out on the landscape. When you look at publications, discourses, conferences, and the like, the most unifying language, unfortunately, is still English. And so what happens is when you go to other places, certain words have to get inscribed into that language from their original English form, as opposed to in translation. Just like the word democracy and the word gender. So feminism is going to have to enter in its own right. And I'm sorry to say, I think that's the end of that. It's just that I live in Indonesia, and they use both gender and feminism. That's just what they use because it's not in their language. I've seen, you know, back in the day, I want to say back in the day, but you know, before the 21st century, you know, I actually went round and round with people about, you know, particularly the Arabic equivalent, because most of my research has to do with Arabic and Arabic sources. And I realized, no, it's not going to fit. You're going to be pushing certain words, and you know, those words, maybe they'll gain efficacy. I'm not a, you know, I'm not you know, an etymologist. I don't know in terms of like all languages, how they evolve. But for the moment, what I'm doing is seeing that words like democracy and words like gender have entered into those languages from their English formula. And it may be that feminism will have to stay in the English formula and just be sort of, morphed into the sort of equivalent pronunciation of it accordance to the other languages.
Thank you, Kali and Asha, once again for the brilliant questions. And thank you, Dr. Amina, for this really expansive and clear and brilliant answer. I do have a hand from Ahmed Abu Zaid, my colleague at the University of St. Andrews. Please do get ahead and ask your question.
Just 1 second, Ahmed, I lost my pen.
I'm sorry.
I'm only in a hotel room. Where could it possibly go? All right, I'm going to try to remember. I don't have a good memory because I didn't.
And I will try to be brief as well.
No, you take your own time.
Thank you very much, Malaka, and thank you very much, Professor Amina, for this fantastic talk. It's really rich and to engage with and reflect on. I have two questions, if you don't mind. The first one is about the gap between theory and practice in this regard, like, because you kindly keep mentioning that you work on a Quranic studies, which is for a large extent, it's a theoretical thing. And I don't know if this is considered to be enough to highlight about the practices, especially, for example, in fiqh studies. I don't know if you think about bringing the fiqh next to Islamic or to Quranic study, taking in consideration there is a many advanced and progressive fiqh, like Abu Hanifa in the 8th century. He have a very progressive in today terms opinion about women and about women rule in life, in public life. And of course you mentioned Rab'a al-Adawiyya, but what about also many examples of feminists, if we can also use the word of today to highlight the role of women who work in fiqh, especially from Ahl al-Bayt or from the Prophet house. The other one about, I will echo with Sarah, talk about the medieval or the Islamicate, if you want a more appropriate concept for medieval Islamic. For example, away from the Quranic study, there is many unnotable sources like Al-Barzari, for example. He have 12 volume called A'lam al-Nubala fi al-Qarn al-Tasi', the notable people in the 9th century. And he dedicated one whole volume for women, notable women and notable figures in 9th century. I count them, it's 1,200 names, like merchant and leading role in public life, economic life, social life. So and I think, I don't know if you could take it in consideration for your future project, can we extend or expand the Quranic study with fiqh and with Islamic sources from pre-modern area to understand more the phenomenon of Islamic feminism or the woman in Islamic context? Thank you very much, and I'm sorry for.
Yes, I did several times talk about the wedding of my particular area of specialty with a larger project called Islamic Feminism in Action, which has to do with the wedding between the way fiqh is practiced on the ground. I do want to have a caveat with regard to this, since it's coming up, but I don't want to forget this thing about the medieval and about this volume with, one volume with women and 39 other volumes, but don't let me forget those. Okay, so the thing is that the rubric of fiqh, as it evolved over the first 300 years, was developed with a particular notion that we cannot have Islam unless we can put Islam into practice. And then how do we adjudicate practice? How do we understand, for lack of a better, no, I won't say Islamization. How do we understand what is Muslim praxis? And obviously fiqh was developed using certain source texts amongst them the Quran, the Hadith, and the Sunnah, but the formulas that they used with regard to them were completely selected by the persons doing it. Obviously, out of thousands of schools of thought, when we consolidate down to the 4 Sunni schools and a number of Shia schools, when we consolidate down, to this number, there's going to be amazing text that will take the discourse further, but those were not the ones that were put into implementation to be carried over to the current century, which is always our objective. Our objective is always where we are now. I love the fact that the Islamic intellectual tradition is rich and varied. I get lost in it all the time. I got lost in the fiqh, dealing with gender non-binary sexualities, more so than I got lost in the tafsir or the seerah. It was something about the discourses at that time that was really fascinating. So there's amazing principles that are there. And in fact, part of the work that we do in Musawa is to be able to draw from some of these principles to put into application in our modern context. Things like, ikhtilaf, how do different schools adjudicate with regard to the differences of opinions and how they might use an opinion from somewhere else, and maslaha. So there is an active engagement with certain principles in order to push forward the agenda of gender equality. So let me go back. Gender equality in our current situation is the objective. And what happens is, unfortunately, the record is too biased towards men and their opinions to allow for a single volume amongst 40 volumes to make me feel excited. I also need to make the distinction that I have made here, but sometimes it gets lost. And that is the received knowledge that is Islam, not just revelation, but also, the notion that, the prophetic sunnah is a model. We have these received knowledge components. And women were receivers of those knowledges as well. And so we have a much richer in number history of women as memorizers of some of these received knowledges, hadith, even ulum al-fiqh, or the kinds of discourse, usul al-fiqh, the kinds of discourses that went into the jurisprudence. They were receivers of those. They were not the producers. So I don't care if it's 1,200 names, to be quite honest. Not a one of them left enough that we are following those footsteps right now. However, we are following the trajectory, and that trajectory is important whether it comes from women or men. So yes, we are most definitely, for me, I consider Reform Islam or Progressive Islam to necessarily be a continuation of discourses that have already happened. A critical analytical reading of those discourses to challenge certain biases, race, class, gender, sexuality, ableism, and the like, but at the same time, not to throw the baby out with the bath. So I'm not talking about a severance from Islamic intellectual traditions. I'm too immersed in it, and personally, I do love it so much. However, I'm definitely talking about the end of patriarchy. And when I start talking about the end of patriarchy, you can't placate me with a number of 1,200 women. I need to see gender equality in Abu Hanifa, and unfortunately, I don't see it. To give permission to lead Salat during Tarawih, to me, is not the same thing as understanding that no one ever took the right for me to perform as the imam away from me, except for other men in interpretation. So I just think that, yes, there's a lot of jewels. There's a lot of gems. I like it. We're sort of, searching into this intellectual legacy to find certain gems, to sift them out and to put them into application. But we need to be putting them into application today. We need to be able to deal with the discrepancy, because even when there were these spaces, these radical, and gender inclusive spaces or persons, they did not become the law of the land. They did not become the culture in which most Muslims have been acculturated, so that we not only think there is a male God, but we definitely think that the Insan al-Kamil according to people like Al-Ghazali, you know, it's basically going to be men, and women can do really good jobs, but they can't be in San Kamen. So, I mean, there's the reading of it does not mean that everything that everybody said before was bad or, you know, inefficient or whatever. It simply means that there was this tendency towards patriarchy. By the way, women participate in patriarchy as well. So I don't mean a cisgendered female necessarily provides the model for gender liberation. I just think that she has a voice, and that voice should be heard when it's not. But I don't think that we're saying, what I'm saying is that because there were 1,200 women, that somehow we don't have a voice. We didn't have a voice because that voice was silenced. And that voice was silenced, you know, aggressively. And when we came through colonialism, the absence of that voice was encoded into the state. And now what we're trying to do is to dismantle that so that we can allow for the affirmation of all citizens as having the right to participate in any policy that's going to be applied to them in the way that they achieve their moral excellence. So I hope that helps. I love your scarf.
Thank you, Dr. Amina. Thank you, Ahmed. You kind of reminded me also of what Arundhati Roy once said: there is no such thing as the voiceless. There is only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. We have, I think, 4 questions, and we have about 20 minutes to go through them. So I will ask Ola Kadum first to go here, and then we'll hear from Layla, and I will also encourage Paula and Nermeen to ask their questions directly to Dr. Amina, if that is possible. If not, I'm happy to ask those questions if we have time as well. Please go ahead, Ola.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Wadud, for that really illuminating talk. It's been thoroughly thought-provoking. I wondered whether you could talk about what vision you have for this reformist Islam going forward. I mean, is it to have a reinterpreted Islamic law that takes into account women's lived experience in each locale so that we have tailored Islamic feminisms in each context? Or is it a universal Islamic feminism that would be applied to each context? Because I'm just thinking, I can imagine that there would be points of contention even between Islamic feminisms about various issues. So would there have to be an Islamic feminist council in each country, for example? How would this work operationally so as to be inclusive for women of all classes, sexualities, races and ages, etc.? And a second, if I may,
I would love to do your second question, but without my pen, which I've looked literally under the table in the chair, and even in my purse I cannot find, I will forget it. So can we come back to it and let me respond to that one first?
The second, yeah.
Is that okay, Malika?
Absolutely, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, okay, so first of all, for me, the word diversity is a form of beauty. I am not trying to universalize anything. People do this all the time. This is like, okay, so we get the answer, we're going to apply it to everybody. Absolutely, positively, 100% no. And I want to tell you in a more practical way, sorry, I looked under the table and now I can't breathe. How it is that I came to understand this, because I think it will help to debunk the notion that somehow what we're trying to do is to create a single vision of Islam and then make everybody do it. When Musawa started, it identified, and it still identifies itself as a movement. And to understand the subtlety of this takes a lot of time, because with all of our affiliates in so many other countries, people refer to the secretariat as if it is Musawa, as opposed to the movement. So the movement for equality has to address the specific inequalities in each context.
Yeah.
Otherwise, again, you presume that there is a single formula that when you apply it to everybody, everybody is going to receive the same result from it, and that's not true. Because of the dynamics of intersectionality, there are going to be different things that will be manifest that need to be approached. I do think Tawheed is universal, but literally other than Tawheed, I don't think anything else is. I think everything else is circumstantial. And I do find that circumstance and situation is a part of the human journey. We are meant to live our lives in very specific ways, at very specific times, very specific places. So no, there is not a goal that somehow we're going to come up with this perfect model, and this perfect model is going to be perfect for all times and all places. That's what got us in trouble in the first place. So now I'll take your second question.
Thank you so much for that. No, I thought that's what you meant, but I just wanted the clarification. Thank you. And the second question was just out of interest. And with the discussions you've had with experts in the Quran and Hadith and fiqh with women, I was just interested to know if you could share a bit about what aspects of Islamic feminism have been the most contentious amongst these discussions. And also, I was very curious to know, in terms of the lived experiences with the women that you've worked with in Malaysia and Indonesia, what were their issues, the issues that came up for them that were most important? Perhaps to debunk some of these more kind of European ideas of what Muslim women go through, but can we actually hear from the women themselves? What were the issues that they faced in their lives that were more problematic, that they wanted addressing through an Islamic feminism?
Yes, so nobody said I want an Islamic feminism to address this issue. So, you know, my focus on Islamic feminism, again, it's not to make it into the beacon of light that everybody has to follow in order to get to Allah. Don't do that. You don't even have to be a feminist to benefit from the kind of work that I'm talking about. You don't have to identify as feminist for me to work along with you. As long as you're not working against me, you know, and my right to be, I can work with you. So I can work with secular feminists. I can work with men. Just let's let that drop in the air as if it's.
I meant more the kind of that you're talking about, the reciprocity and the equality. What were those dimensions that they wanted addressing?
Yes, so I do currently live in Indonesia, and Indonesia is the first place in the world to establish a Muslim Women's Ulama Council to give fatwas. And amongst the first 3 fatwas that they gave was on the issue of child marriage. We have a substantial rural population, and it is very common for there to be, you know, an exchange of, you know, a young girl to another household in order to manage things in life for people who are managing, you know, literally from the dirt, that is from the soil. And so child marriage is one of the big issues here. Is a bigger issue than, for example, triple talaq. Triple talaq is a main issue that came up in India. And the Musawa affiliates who have been working against this practice have done so on the grounds of we need to re-examine the text, and we need to understand the implications of the particular fiqh application of those texts that's in play in our own context. Other places that we have been working with, for example, is the issue of polygamy. So there is not a single issue that everyone has equally. And to stay flexible to that means that we have to work in such a way that lived reality comes to the front. Now, the method of understanding about lived realities is also very, what's the word I want to say, methodical. It's, you know, we collect data with regard to what's actually happening, you know, on a country by country basis. And from that data, we juxtapose the results to what is the projection. And the projection is supposed to be justice. It's also supposed to be Islam. But we're saying that in some ways, there's a disconnect between the results of a particular system put into place in the name of Islam and, say, justice or equality or karama, dignity or whatever. So it is necessary to do your work, to do your research on your own context, but also to look at the change makers and the policy enforcers. In other words, who are your allies within those who have a certain amount of power as far as the way the nation states go. And so aligning with certain, you know, more liberal, progressive, you know, politicians, policymakers, ministers, has also a part of strategically how you do that. So you can't identify for every country who that's going to be. It has to be done on a country by country basis. And then of course the element of knowledge production, which includes this interrogative reading of Islamic sources. But the purpose of the reading is the context. The purpose is to bring it to bear on the data collected with regard to the realities, to the attention of the jurors, the judges, and the lawyers in the, the Sharia courts and the like, and the politicians, who have some stake in it, or who are taking a certain position because they think they will win the Muslim vote, if it's like not a Muslim majority context. So there is a dynamic relationship that goes on between real actors on the ground, but the principal actor has to be the women themselves and their lived reality. So, it's not a cut and paste. It's really dynamic, and I hope it maintains its dynamism, for the rest of eternity. Because losing that dynamism to me was something that was a problem, after the colonial period, where we sort of calcified Islam into this thing that couldn't stretch and bend and flow freely. In order to address the challenges to come up in our day, like, coronavirus or something. So, I hope you can understand that it is not meant to establish this new worldview, this new world order, and then everybody has to follow that world order from now till eternity. I just literally cannot believe that, period. So I don't know how to defend it because it's just so far from my vision, except to give you examples of how people have worked in application in very specific places.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Ola, and thank you, Dr. Amina. We have a question from Layla, and then if we have time, we're going to go to two more questions in the chat, but we'll see how it goes. Layla, go ahead, please.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you so much for your rich talk, Dr. Amina. I have a question on how you approach CEDAW and the international law and women within the framework of BRISMES theme this year. So when you mentioned CEDAW, you emphasized the importance of lived experiences and the judicial challenges of implementing CEDAW in Muslim countries. However, I'm wondering from a decolonial perspective, whether you also approach international law epistemologically as well. So how do you tackle Eurocentrism in international law? What I see is that while much of your talk and work has been focused on the deconstructing apparent patriarchal interpretations, I guess I'm wondering if you're also concerned with deconstructing Eurocentrism in international law. And I pose this question because what I see from my own research is that one of the biggest issues with those who oppose CEDAW is the fact that it's based on a world order that still serves to uphold Eurocentric domination. And if this problem is not tackled, aren't you risking creating more opposition in Muslim local context than necessary, and consequently marginalizing the impact of your work in Muslim Muslim contexts? So I guess it's related to the question of Ula as well, how you harmonize the contextualism that you just emphasized with so-called universal rights in international law. And I guess my question is also related to Nadmina Abessi's question in the chat. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. Actually, this is the trajectory that I was always on, and I used to always make references to it because the whole notion of the UN Declaration of Human Rights is a construct. It came into existence in the middle of the 20th century in reaction to certain historical and political locations with regard to the global north. And so it's not in this paper for some reason, so never mind, I'm just going to jump right in. With the exception of very few countries, most countries, nation states have ratified CEDAW. So that's the only way that we go into it. We do not go into it as a way to affirm that the United Nations is in fact universal. It's not. And that's a short answer. I don't need to elaborate. It simply is not. And I'm not, again, I'm not going to elaborate because you need to think strategically with regard to, I don't know where you're living, but if you're living in one of those countries that are implementing this so-called Islamic law, and on the basis of that law, they're denying certain citizenship rights to women in the name of Islam, And then they project those even when they have signed and ratified CEDAW to say, well, we can't do that because that's not Islam. The methodology that we are using is a methodology of interrogating when the state exploits certain paradigms and definitions of Islam that are detrimental to women. We are not fixing the UN. It's a job that definitely needs to happen, but it's not the job that we're taking up. We are taking up state implementation of certain laws when the state has a constitution and the state is a signator and a ratifier of CEDAW. That's it. Now, the problem with CEDAW, which is not the problem that you mentioned, because of course it's beyond the scope of looking at, sort of the epistemological limitations of the constructions of human in the context of the whole UN rubric, which is a whole lovely discussion. The problem is that we are addressing on the ground realities. I love philosophy, epistemology, hermeneutics, and I could go at it for a long time trying to deconstruct the ways in which, the dominant construction of the whole UN human rights rubric is based on the global north. I could go there, but that's not going to save the child marriage. So that's where we are. We come in on the basis of very specific needs in a very specific country, and that country has ratified CEDAW, which also is appendaged with their ratification of the rights of the child. Some of the places where people have been challenging the child marriage rubric has been with regard to family and family law, but most of them have been successful because they have also ratified the UN Declaration of the Rights of the Child. They say it's not in the child's best interest. So you need to move away from the abstract, which is a wonderful conversation, needs to be had over and over again, but it's not the conversation that I'm having here. The only place where I'm abstract is with regard to theology. And because I love that, it is my honor to have had this relationship with both Sisters in Islam and the Musawa movement from the beginning of both of them, because it takes me out of my head, because the whole notion of deconstruction is that you just keep deconstructing, you never go anywhere. I'm not a deconstructionist, I'm a reconstructionist. And the grounds of the reconstruction with regard to this trajectory is, how do we establish just and equitable laws for every citizen in the context of today's reality, which is the nation state. As far as epistemology goes, don't let me get started on my complaints with regard to the nation state as the binding unit, but that is the unit that we're operating under. And because we're still operating under that, it is on the basis of particular nation states and their capacity to address the ways in which certain policies disenfranchise certain members of their citizenship that we're working. We're not working to dismantle the UN. It's a great job. I welcome you to do it. I would support you in doing it. I'm not really interested, but I am interested in things like the rights of the child or women who are abandoned because of certain notions of polygamy and the big one, of course, domestic violence. So let's go back to the issues just for my talk, and then we'll have another talk where we can talk about all of the shortcomings of the United Nations, which is in fact a construction of the global north.
Thank you, Dr. Amina, and thank you, Laila, for, I thought it was a brilliant question and really enriching response. I do have a question from Nermeen, which was very similar to what Laila asked, and I have been in touch with Nermeen, and she's happy with the question. So we'll just skip that. I have one final question from Paula, who is also a member of the BRISMES Council. She said, thanks again for this enriching talk. I would like to ask if you could please address queer Islamic cosmology / epistemology as a way to expand space for non-binary people. Thank you.
Yes, let me just check my clock because I have to think how long they were going to be on here. And this is not tongue in cheek, actually. The end of my paper goes into more detail with regard to it. Because of methodologies of reading the Quran and the way in which we interpret the Lut story and what that says, and particularly what it says to lay Muslims in the context of culture and certain types of sentiment. But for me, basically, well, first of all, I work in alignment with other queer activists and scholars. So, you know, a lot of the research is not my own. I'm indebted to, you know, work that's been done by others before me. But I did have this opportunity to do this 3-year research where I decided I wanted to examine first Quranic language, tafsir about, you know, the Quran, the Quranic language, then seerah and hadith, and then the last part was fiqh. But I limited it to the first 500 years in order to see what the foundational discourses was, because again, the development of the nation state, the imposition of colonialism and all of that, our laws have been morphed, and they have not been morphed into the best results. But the interesting thing is that for me, when I did the research, I named the project Gender Diversity and Human Dignity. And that meant that I went into the Quran, particularly with a perspective. And that perspective was that لَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ, I've given karama or dignity to, all the sons and daughters, you know, of the first human, and that any place where any of the interpreters or commentators or whatever, any place where they veer off from human dignity and justify what I would consider to be, you know, homophobic and other phobic types of articulations in the name of interpretation and the like, I would consider them to have strayed away from this basic and fundamental principle. So that was where I started. Where I ended up, however, which I did talk about, in this paper, which is going to be published in the online journal called Religion. So if anybody wants to track it down, it should be there soon. Where I ended up instead was with a consideration that the emphasis that are placed on qat'i verses, that is definitive statements made in the Quran, of which there are not that many, especially for the purpose of law. They're less than 100, depending on who's doing the counting, but there's a couple hundred if you say by spirit or, implication. But there was this predominance of reading of qat'i verses as if everything had a solution. And the most wonderful thing that came out of doing the Quranic research with regard to the story of Lut is that there are more questions that you come out of that story with than there are answers. And all of a sudden it occurred to me that it is, in fact, this liminal space that provides us with the opportunity for, what's being called by many as a queer reading. And that embracing the liminal space, especially by aligning it with the necessity, in other words, it's a Quranic mandate, that is our entire teleology. We are created for the purpose of agency with karama, with dignity. That any place where there is a violation of that dignity, to me, is improper. Let me just use a non-Islamic or fiqh type term, is improper. And instead, we're trying to construct another understanding of the dignity of humanity, even through, the places in the Quranic discourse, which are not clear with regard to who's doing what and what exactly they're doing and what is the problem, and, why is it that the wife of Lut is mentioned more times than these, these men who are raping other men, So there are more questions to come out of it. And all of a sudden, I found a certain beauty in the ambiguous. And because there are more, if you categorize the 7 major passages, I think there's like 30 some odd places where Lut might be mentioned, but the major passages that actually, talk about what was going on, and that everybody swears that because of these verses that, homosexuality is prohibited in Islam. I don't even know where they get it. First of all, there's no word homosexuality. That's a new term. But secondly, homosexuality has to do with a whole lot of different possibilities, including 2 women, and that didn't even make it into Islamic law for a long time. So there's so many more questions that come out of this. Actually, it became the joy of the investigation for me, because I feel like personally I was challenged to not have as definitive an answer as I felt like I was able to conclude working with the Quran, working just on gender within the sort of cisgendered heteronormative, dominant rubric of it. And so we are going back to the drawing board. And I'll tell you, I'll let you in on a little secret, because this is where I'm going next with it as much as I can. And that is to say that as we all live under the nation state, and in the nation state, there is a qualification known as citizen. And people can be like me. I'm an expat. I have a visa for living, if I want to, the rest of my life in Indonesia. Well, it's on an annual basis, but I'm just saying that you have certain rights, that the fulfillment of your karam or your dignity as a human being is dependent upon the state. And in the state, every child is supposed to have certain rights, and those rights are supposed to follow them into their adulthood. However, just like with the gender jihad, we have been sidestepping those rights for people who are non-binary LGBTQI. And that means that we can go back to the state in terms of reconstructing the ways in which it fulfills the notion of karama. While the notion of karama can be said to become from an Islamic source, its implementation in the context of law and culture is going to be based on state. Again, we have to be very specific. So that's where it is that I want to see things happen in the future. And that is a challenge to the state when it encodes certain practices, supposedly in the name of Islam, but the end result is that they actually cause visible harm to people who do not follow the heterosexual dominant model. So yeah, there's a lot of exciting possibilities and a lot of amazing work. I did mention that I'm trying to start an international program on queer Islamic studies and theology. So please keep me in your prayers, because I really want to help to establish this trajectory to make an affirmation of the lived realities for queer Muslims.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Amina, wadud. We're ending just now. Thank you so much for this enriching talk. And just judging by the chat comments, which we don't have that much time to go through, I'm sure we all learned something new today and have been challenged in some ways. So thank you for your time and such a clear, comprehensive and critical work. And thanks to all colleagues as well for being with us and sticking beyond the allocated time. Thank you for all your brilliant questions, and we'll hopefully see many of you later in the BRISMES sessions. Thank you once again, and do take care and have
Thank you so much.
Sessions later on.